And what I came up with in my little thing is that it's really much about color, and it's really much about many images. And we saw some more from Alexander. So that would be a starting point to reflect on lines of analysis that I would go and that I would like to explore within a corpus like that. And a very classical theme, but at the same time interesting to pursue, is the representation. What has changed in the representation of the virus per se? And the Web Archive, what that does in terms of images is that I get an image collection of what was in that qual during that week, and I can extend that. I had a second example, but I'll skip that for time reasons because I really want to open the discussion. That was about a Twitter collection we did on a court trial in France. We can come back to that. And I would like to conclude with one of the pioneers of web history. It was Niels Berger, who has written the handbook on web history, who says that basically there's 5 steps. There's the online web, there's collecting it, there's preserving it, there's remaking this available in terms of being able to use it and analyze it. And that's where institutions like BNF, INA, and the Spanish National Library come in. And it's only then that we can go to the scholarly use. And then it's back to historian's business or social sciences business, basically. What is your question, and work from there? Thank you.
The way, so I have this kind of questions, that's why I'm saying that, so that you can address it too.
You told us about Frederick Claver and his collection of Twitter, and he's using the API of Twitter, so we don't. But what's interesting that there is this huge amount of data, but at the same time, Frederick Claver sent an email to us, to me, and he asked for a copy of the main website of the Strasbourg Hospital during the period of March 2020, and we don't have any copy of the website, in fact, because we have selected a platform launched by the hospital, but for it to select the main website. So there is a huge amount of data, but you can find layer of data too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to the two speakers for the interesting, stimulating presentation they have made. It's just a comment. It's really fascinating. All the new world we have in front of us with all the network and the webs. But it's really something that your presentations help us to manage all this stuff. It's sometimes I feel overcome. It's really it's very helpful, extremely helpful to think about, and it's really something to. It's a practical example of the fact historians and documentalists, we have to work together, we have to join forces in order to cope with all this stuff. Other way, it's not way to do this. For years I've been insisting, and I think it's going more and more, people is becoming more and more aware about this, that the importance of the programs of postgraduate programs in history of medicine, science and technology to emphasize and to involve the documentalists in order to show the basic skills to the postgraduate students to deal with all this stuff. And for me, it's something that I think that perhaps in another life I will do it. I'm not entirely convinced that I am trying to do it this time, but it's really fascinating, and it's really the only way to make sense of history, the present history, of course, the history of the present, but also to revisit the past history. So that's all. Thank you.
Can I just answer something to that? Thank you, John. I think, first of all, I'm the perfect example of the fact that you don't need to understand a lot about informatics to be able to work with archives. I'm not a computer specialist. I can run my own computer barely, and I have not a huge amount of knowledge about that. What I find interesting and fascinating, and something I like to do, is that you can construct a research project and you have to collaborate. And the work we're doing is with Caroline Sala, with Solène Lianji, who are co-authors of what I presented to you. It's just me who's here because that's the way it is. They are at Transfusion next week. And it's teamwork. And we did a work with Twitter accounts where we didn't just get the Wayback Machine and the data in BNF, but they sent us the data files. That's it, the entire thing. The first time I opened that, it was just code. All I had was pages and pages of informatic code. I've never coded anything in my life, so I was before that thing like a Spanish cow in front of I don't know what. And then we decided, well, we need someone who can help us with that. And we found a student who is in informatics and linguistics, and we worked in a team of 4. But that's okay. You don't have to be a specialist for everything. But I mean, I've spent my last 10 years of my professional life trying to convince historians that it's good if you want to study public opinion to look at written journals for the 20th century, but probably there have been media sets and settings that have been much more important and influential. And if you don't look at television history, you're just not going to get a lot of things. And if you're still stuck in your paper because you're a historian and written sources, you might need to move a little bit if you want to get up to the page. And I mean, now I'm starting to argue that historians need to do the same thing with web archives. And once again, and I think you're absolutely right, and Ian is right on that too. I think the central message to transmit here is to say you don't have to be a computer specialist. Actually, it's probably better if you're not. Because if you're a computer specialist, you're going to produce word clouds of things you're neither interested nor knowledgeable about. So you're producing kind of maps and things, aesthetic, nice graphs, but so what? There's no question behind it, and I prefer a historical question. And that takes us back. You can always compare it to other archives and work with them and contextualize it and say, what were the last 20 years of crisis, what were the last 100 years of pandemics, and what does that? And I mean, we're back to questions from yesterday. What does that change? And what changes and what continues to be patterns that help us in a longer durée approach to explain certain things, scapegoating and all kinds of reactions.
Maybe to give some example of such a project, of course there's also common children researchers and historians that are working with us. And the first two that were coming to work with us, in fact, it's because very often they lost their corpora. First reason for conventional history, because sometimes you're in thesis and you work on some website. It is a part of the resources you are using, of course. And if you lose your source and if the website disappear or change, so for them it was really important to know that it was preserved by the library. So I think it's also important for conventional history. And another point, so what we can see about COVID-19 collection is maybe that in 2020, at that time, I was asked very often about the collection, and there was some research project that were launched at that time, and there were always about memory. Memory and how to engage people. That was the main focus of this kind of project. Or maybe made a survey of the collection made in France, for example. But now in 2022 we have also new projects, more in science and with a long-term perspective. For example, project about vaccination and political controversies, but from the 90s to now. So it's interesting because in the 90s, individual choice didn't be so important that now in this for people. I mean, you know, I remember from when I was a child, you go to vaccination, there was no question. So, but it changes. So it changes in 30 years. So this is a research project on a long durée. Another project is about, I don't know if it's what the name is, genomic, and it starts from the macros and the dolly, the shape, yeah. So it starts also from the 90s to now, and to study how it changed in the political controversy too. And the researcher participated to the datathon, and he used an old collection, the 2002 election collection. So that we have indexed, so he could search web page related to his domain of biology in the program at that time. And so he find a website that has disappeared. Some of them he knows about it, but he had never seen them. So he was very happy to find them in the archives. So okay, this is two examples. So.
Giacomo?
Thank you for your presentations. And I was asking to myself, well, we all know that sources are not something neutral. The producer, the context, even what is unwritten is a sort of source in itself. So I was asking to myself, the web is a different context. So there are already some studies, some methodological studies on how to approach and deconstruct the source, the producer, and so on.
Yes, there clearly is, and I think that basically means you have to go maybe to the handbook of Innsbruck and people like that, where historians have looked a lot at the context. What's really interesting about web archives, I mean, in a certain sense, it's the dream of any historian, in the sense that if you have a tweet, you know who's tweeted it, you know when it was tweeted, you know you can look who's the author behind that, etc. But much more than that, you've got all the responses to it. So, I mean, the thing that historians of television and visual media have been discussing and pondering about for 50 years now, what is the reception of this? Internet does it for you. You have the reception. It has 100,000 views. Okay, what does it mean? You don't know. But you have reactions to that. You have immediate responses to it. You've got a complete network to it. And I mean, that's really great about, be this a YouTube channel, be this a tweet, or be it a website. You've got immediate public responses to that. So the contextualization of something on the web is incredibly dense. And the work the historians can do with that is incredibly intensive. For me, really, the main problem is at that point is, how are you going to manage the mass and the micro? In one of the Twitter studies we did on the court trial, we had a small crawl. It was only 200,000. That's a small crawl. And within that, we broke it down to look at individual videos that were included in those tweets. And one of the things that we ended up finding that was one of the results, that's going to be in one of the publications we're going to do next, is that television showed voices of victims 3 days before the opening of the trial. The night of the opening trial, the voices were only for the accused and perpetrators. And the Twitter sphere retweeted the victim account filmed on television 3 days earlier, the day of the court trial. So that was really, I found that really interesting. But you needed to go down to analyze that the tweet of the day of the opening of the trial had a video that was not the TV show of that day, but the TV show of 3 days earlier that brought the victims back in. But it wasn't social media that brought them in, and television had landed them out at precisely that day. So in terms of analysis, I found that really fascinating, and you can go very far with it. But I mean, we are talking about one visual you need to analyze in an ocean of 200,000 tweets, and compare that it's not the same as the TV visual that night on public television. So how do you deal with the fact that you've got 200,000 of these, and sometimes you're just going to pick out one single thing and you're going to analyze the content of the video that is linked to that tweet. And that really, I think, we need to work on how to navigate that kind of thing. How do you find things like that, etc.
To follow up on that, I think I would like to disagree with you a little bit when you say that in Twitter you know who's writing, when they're writing, and what the response is. Because you know there are trolls around, there are whole armies of people who are paid by governments or by other agencies who have an interest in shifting the appearance of digital reality in their interests. And so I think again, this is nothing new. I mean, we also know this in the anarchist world, that there's fake news. But I think the fact that it's so easy to do that on the internet now, it's so cheap to do that on such a large scale, to me raises a new question, how to deal with that. And this is, as you know, I live in China now, so a lot of what is going on the lockdown there now only gets known because somebody posts something. And often these postings survive for just minutes. I mean, I have people I find them on WeChat, and then when I try to click them 5 minutes later, they're gone. So I don't know how to deal with that. So I guess it's a question to you, it's also a question to what's her name? to the gentleman on the right. I'm not sure I understood correctly what you are like study of India?
There is a coordination at the national level because we're working with the correspondent in the BNF from the team activities department, so it helps to collect something about law, about science, about art during the lockdown, but also with colleagues in public library in the regional area of France. So there is more than 20 partners that are working with us, And at the national levels, we are a member of IDC, this is a consortium with a lot of national library. And so we have launched this collection, COVID-19 collection. First email, if I remember, it was in the end of January 2020. So we decided very quickly, in fact. And we did this because the collection, this international collection, is available on IT archive for everyone, everywhere, and it's searchable. Okay. But another example is.
It is still national, right? You're not
no, it's international because each national library gives some of them selections. Not all the selections, not possible, and there is no YouTube channels collect. For example, it's only websites, no social media. But we sent, I think, 400 selections. The number of URLs it's not the same. It's less than for the national collection, of course. And so it's international because each national library provides some selected URLs. But there is sometimes exception. I mean, for South America, Brazil did a lot of selection for other countries because there was no colleagues in this country to send some selections.
Short answer, I was told. You're right, and I don't agree with some of the questions you asked here. The first thing is, why is all this national? Because there's legal rights behind that. There's authorship on web pages, and there's the personal data protection on many of the social media exchanges. So you have, and there's national laws that protect that or that frame that, and they're different from country to country. So that's why countries work by their own standards. France, for example, has a legal deposit. That means that you're allowed to crawl this and to capture it, but BNF is not allowed to give it out outside its own and physical entity. So if I want to work with these archives, which is really contradictory, they're all on the web, but if I want to study the historical web archive, I have to go to Paris to the BNF to do that, or do what we did in Strasbourg, to get a terminal in Strasbourg so we can work in-house, but we still have to be in the library to work with it. I can't do that at night in my office or anybody anywhere else. And that's where the national site comes in. What is fascinating, nevertheless, I mean, trolls are not trolls. I agree with that, and evidently that's true. But the set of data you get is so enormous in terms of what is behind it as metadata, as data, that if you do a crawl, if you got the data, we spend most of the time on the Mediator drug scandal crawl, cleaning the data, but you can do it, and you can have things in and out and see what that changes, etc. You can bring the trolls in, you can kick them out because you identify them. There's ways to do that informatically, and then you can see what that changes in the picture. And the impressive thing about the web, working with the web archives, is that you've got the whole data set, so you just tell the computer, ignore anything that has whatsoever. You get the results within 3 seconds, with it, without it. put it back in, etc. So you can really play with it, but you have to control the data, and that's probably the biggest job. And you don't even see it when you publish it, because the translation of it is really quick. But the fundamental question is, what is your initial source data worth, and is it clean? Does that make sense? No.
Yes. But I don't have so much trust in technology, but I guess I'm wrong.
I would like to complete my previous answer about collection, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because IPC didn't launch a collect actually. It will in a few weeks, but we didn't because we were not the first. You know, Christian said, I think it's an important idea. To be the first is really important. So there was also a collect of the web harvesting launched by an American university. So we decided to refer to this collect because it was first. We react they write more quickly than us. Okay, so we decided to do another collection that would be not really the same than this collection that was first.
Thank you. So if we want to have a coffee break, we can have one question, because I think there are a question, but a very, very short question.
It can be later.
And a very short answer.
Very short. Yes.
Okay, I try to keep it very short. It is quite a general question, I think, but regarding the micro level you were talking about, but also regarding COVID, because I remember during COVID what was very important for me, like to frame and to make sense of what was happening, was private messages I exchanged with people, not like on social media, but like emails or WhatsApp or whatever. And what you said about the thing of entering intimacy of people thanks to the internet, I think it's true, but also it's a specific intimacy that is like mediated by the media, but also like what you want to make public as an intimacy. So it's not, we all know there is a difference. So I was wondering if there were some project of private internet archives, of like collecting them or archiving them on digital archives also, like what happens to your email after you're done, basically?
Yeah, we don't collect email because it's private. During the private situation, we collect Facebook, we can't do it on our web. We collect Facebook, except private group. So this is the limit of our legal framework. But for us, ENF, the duty is only the web, okay? But I know that archivists in French department, local archivists, have sometimes collect more specific to local, related local, with various type of resources, including sometimes email or material, but also all digital. So, in fact, it depends on the project.
Thank you very much. So I think we can continue this conversation during the coffee break. Thank you very much, Alexandre. Thank you very much, Christian. And okay, we can have a coffee break.
Ça, c'est le panneau qu'il faut. Et ici, il a Internet. Ah, ça marche pas.
Non, mais ça va, si je le fais, je charge.
Attends, il a des prises là. Tu veux des...
Non, non, mais c'est bon, c'est bon. C'est bon, c'est bon. Non, non.
Et ton PowerPoint, tu l'as...
Briefly to the objective of this session, we will with sources of past and present pandemics. The aim of this session, as I said earlier, is precisely to contrast the profusion of sources of COVID-19, as we were talking about it in the first part of the session, in the guest lecture, with the scarcity of sources I also mentioned earlier. So therefore it's a methodological session which aims to present sources, question and to discuss the present of the research, that means searching, collecting, selecting, editing sources. So originally the workshop program consisted in 4 presentations and was divided in 2 parts. So the first part included 2 papers, one presented by Léa Delmer and another one presented by Alejandra de Leiva, who address the sources for the study of past pandemics. And the second part included 2 papers, one from Helena da Silva and the other one by Barua. They are both historians of medicine, used to searching for sources that sometimes do not exist, and who have become interested in the voluntary initiative to document the current pandemic. So unfortunately, Barua will not be able to connect from Shanghai, as we programmed at the beginning, due to personal reasons. So we will keep the initial order, but just with 3 presentations. So to begin with the past pandemic, and more specifically an endemic disease, in fact, in this case, I will leave the floor to Léa Delmer. So she's a PhD student in Sciences Po Paris, and she's currently a fellow at the French Institute for Anatolian Studies in Istanbul. And she represents the problem she faced with her dissertation on the history of tuberculosis in Turkey after 1945. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Celia, and thank you to the rest of the organization team and everyone who made this great spring school possible. So, as you said, I will present a few elements based on my experience, but I think are somehow representative of the general situation of sources in Turkey, especially but not only regarding health issues. So just a bit of context of my research. So as you said, I work for my PhD thesis on tuberculosis in Turkey from 1945 to 1975. So contrary to a lot of you, I'm not working on one or several crises or outbreaks, but rather on a mobilization and demobilization process with the question of like what made everyone first care about and then not care about anymore a disease that was identified before and kept on existing after. So I am interested in those dynamics, but also in the routine, everyday work on what it says of the public health policies in Turkey, following especially the recent literature that challenged the classical idea of a strong Turkish state and shows, on the contrary, that the state was and is still working thanks to compromises, negotiations, both within its own structures and with private or semi-private bodies. And the period from the 40s to the 80s is a period of relative historiographical gap in Turkey, actually, because there are quite a lot of works on the Ottoman Empire, still quite a lot in the beginning of the Republic, so the 20s till the mid-40s, and of course a large contemporary production in social sciences from the 1980s, but very few works actually in the history of contemporary Turkey outside from political history in a narrow sense. So TB, as you know, is a much studied disease in general, but there are very few works about it in Turkey. First, there is an hagiographic prediction by the actors themselves, especially in the 1970s. Then there are some, especially in the 2000s, studies of discourses focused on the beginning of the Republic. This is a period of icamalism, especially the work of Europan. And very recently, during my thesis, there was this book, which is a tentative social history of TB from the late 19th century until 1955, but actually mostly focused on the early 20th century, and which has a strange or almost absent chronology as it tries to apply to Turkey analysis based on the history of other countries, which gives strange back and forth in the chronology and actually almost no element after the first years of the Republic. So to avoid this and also to avoid a common thing in the history of the region, that is to work mostly with foreign sources, my choice was to avoid using too much foreign archives because my goal was to understand the local construction of the question, not only with a Western point of view regarding the sources. And so given the quasi-absence of work on the question, but also more generally on neighboring topic during this period, I had a free rein, which was quite exciting, but also very few reliable secondary sources to base my work on, given that the ones available are actually not trustable. It's not only a question of point of view, but also I realized during my research that, for example, lots of dates were wrong in the works in the 70s and used by all the secondary literature based on this first mistake. So it's quite a challenging question. So my goal was also not to focus only on discourses, even though I was quite conscious from the beginning it was going to be difficult to have an effective access to practices. And my goal in this presentation is to give another view on my research of sources in Turkey and try to give perspective on how I proceeded in looking for health, so sensitive sources for a period that tends to have no archives kept. So I will not, in this presentation, talk about other sources from, especially from international organizations that I have and that were very useful, but try to focus on the specificity of my work, that is the sources of the history of public health in contemporary Turkey, because it was by far the main challenge of my work, I think. I will present a few epistemological remarks on archives in Turkey, and especially health archives of Republican Turkey, then some more empirical presentation on my own experience, and finally, if I have time, maybe some points to the analysis of the sources I have found. So first, there is a paradox in Turkey. There is a strong bureaucracy, meaning an important production of paper, but there is what is called missing archives, and so following the historian Meltem Aishka, I include both the fact that some archives have been destructed and that one cannot have access to some others, and that often one does not know actually whether they are not accessible or just you cannot have access to them. Aishka summarized it in talking not only about the routine destruction of the archives, but also the general indifferences to public archives in Turkey under the global term of missing archives. And another paradox is in the specific field of tuberculosis. There is an omnipresence of history for the institution. For example, there is always a panel about history in the congresses of the National TB League. In the website there is like small history of the institution. Also in the corridors of the TB section of the Ministry of Health, they are full of old photos, but without anyone actually able to tell their date or where they come from. And so this strong presence of history or memory of the institution and the relative absence on the other side of serious work and established facts on the question. And in general, there is a kind of a fetishization of documents from the archives in history works in Turkey, but they are always understood as Ottoman archives. So, because actually history is Ottoman history in Turkey. Archives of the Republic do exist as an institution, but they have actually no materiality for the researcher, because they are only accessible through a screen. So when you go to the National Archives, all you can do is to look for keywords in an index, and then you have some documents that you can download if you pay for it. And so you can only access the archive through keyword and screen. The good point is that you can choose to go either to the Ankara or the Istanbul side of the archives. Of course, the bad point is that you don't have access to any file. You have only standalone documents, and that seem actually quite random in the choice. And you are also totally dependent on the indexation system operated by the administration of the archive. And there are actually few epistemological work, as far as I know, on the missing archives, or more generally on the use of archives in contemporary history of Turkey. There are some about the Ottoman archives, especially regarding the Armenian genocide, but not on the Republican period, with the exception of the work that I mentioned before of Meddem Ayska, who is drawing on her experience looking for archives to write a history of radio broadcasts in Turkey. And so she wrote an article in 2006 on this. And I am not sure I agree with all her hypotheses, but I think it is important, this article, for the simple fact that it makes the missingness of archives present, and I would like to have read this article before because I discovered it quite late in my research, and I was like, okay, it's not only me, it's maybe a more structural problem if I don't think anything relevant. So she links the missingness of archives with a main concept, which is Occidentalism, that she defines as a kind of reflection of Orientalism applied to themselves by people located in the East, in this case the Turks. That is, according to her, provoked by the anxiety of always already being late to modernity, and that manifests as a refusal to know the complexity and heterogeneity of the social. And to her, archives would be suspect because they are open to the gaze of foreign researcher, and thus, according to her, once again, a researcher from the East would be able to have a point of view on the modernity of the Turkish state. I think this hypothesis may go a bit too far, but she has another hypothesis on the concealing of state violence that seems simpler and more convincing, especially when you hear anecdotes about the destruction of archives after the three coups d'etat that took place in Turkey in the 20th century. Even though it does not explain why the archives as non-state organizations, as I will say later, are also missing. I am maybe not totally convinced by her idea of different regime of truth, but I would like her to develop a bit more this idea, but I think she did not after this article. And also she says that Republic is considered in Turkey as a kind of end of history that would explain to her why the Ottoman archive do exist, while the one for the Republican period are mostly missing. And I'm not sure also of this explanation, but it is true that everyone assumes I work on the Ottoman Empire when I say that I am an historian in Turkey. And so this lack of archives echoes a few works on contemporary Turkey outside from political history, as I said. And in health history, there are even fewer works, and often they are even less based on archives, but there are actually interesting projects regarding oral history I won't develop, but there are some examples here. So this context being set, I will talk a bit about my experience in looking for the missing archives. When I started my research, I localized more or less quickly where I could have access to the published document that could be useful, that I would talk a bit about later. But what I was looking for were unpublished documents, not produced in order to reach the general public, but like letters or evidences of the activities of a dispensary. I was not so much hoping for patient files, but maybe like staff files and so on. So I started looking for them. And it is sure some archives have been produced and stored. There are rooms labeled archives in the different, for example, dispensaries I have visited. And the source I have found also indicates the way a dispensary should function, and that requires, of course, a lot of paper, like for example, 3 cards per patient entering the dispensary and all the kind of routine paper that you're supposed to find in such an institution. The fact that it was recommended for the perfect routine functioning of the dispensary does not mean that it was perfectly applied, of course, but however there are statistics very precise that implies that those numbers were produced in a way or another, meaning there was proper work. But except a small exception I will talk about later, I had never any access to this paperwork. I made various attempts, and it was mostly failures. I've been to TB leagues and dispensaries, so in various places. I had contact with some people in charge from some other cities. I've been to congresses and so on. I was often actually given documents, but it was always a published book I had already had access to at the library, and not much more. And I was also often advised to read or even send by email the text of some doctor who were considered as the historian of the movement, and was told everything was inside, so there was no need for more research, as if it was the only source I could use. And I was also told contradictory information. Among those, it is actually difficult to know what is reality and what is myth, regarding, for example, the sending of some archives to a recycling factory after the 1980s coup. And given there is no centralization of archives, so it was necessarily an experience from person to person. It was actually a really nice experience, I have to say, and also not one I was prepared for as an historian, contrary, I think, to some of our fellow anthropologues here, for example. There was much paternalism, of course, as I am young, I am a woman, I am a foreign person, I am not a doctor. But also, I think because it is really not common to look for archives, and my interlocutors did not understand what I was looking for, and it somehow looked suspicious. So, and I never managed to present it in a way that was acceptable, I guess, for them, and I never knew how to do so. And I actually ended up in some situation I was really not prepared to deal with. For example, I had to translate a consultation for francophone patient in a TB center just because I was here and speaking French, and so this kind of thing that you don't expect to come across when you just like look for papers. And I had quite a lot of false hopes, let's say, often based on the polysemy in Turkish of the word archive, which means archives, but also any kind of old enough document, including as book or journal. So often I was said, yes, of course we have archives, and then I was given a book that I had already seen before. So probably I did not insist enough in some places, but actually when I didn't, it was also not much more successful. For example, I've been numerous times in the Istanbul TB leagues, and after being lectured on the activity of the dispensary nowadays and told that the place where the archives were stored burned, which I never managed to know whether it was true or not, and waited a lot and drank a lot of tea and sitting in a small chair in front of the massive office of the director of the dispensary and so on. After maybe the fourth or the fifth visit in a few months, I was finally given access to their libraries that I was never told was existing before, so I got really excited thinking I would finally have access to some papers. But actually, it was mainly a place to store the same books I had already seen before. And another reason for whom I didn't insist so much in some places was that actually the field is not so big, so I was always sent back to some persons who did not seem very willing to help me in the first place. But luckily, I also finally found some other element, but mostly and actually only through a personal relationship that I had. For example, like the documents in the background here, it's from the private archives of a doctor whom a nephew happened to be working with the institute I am now a fellow in, so that's the only way I had some won't develop this on this point then, and just try very quickly to finish on a, let's say, more hopeful point, which is what and how to analyze the sources that were found, because still I have found some sources, not the one I was expecting to work with, but I did find some sources. I will not give a complete typology, but I will focus on some element that seems interesting for my research. For example, the laws are often, I think too often used and be given the status of landmarks, even when they have not been implemented, but the debates on the National Assembly on the rest of the official journal are much less studied, while they can provide interesting clues. For example, the part announcement of the official journal wasn't one of the rare places I could find a few pieces of information regarding the founder of some local TV leagues. Another place where I have found some information on this, and even the one and only list I have of the members of such a local league, was the few applications for recognition of public utility I have found in the National Archives. And there is also, of course, the scientific literature, a bit of general press, the journals of the Ministry of Health and Wealth on welfare. But the two main elements I'm using is grey literature, so the statutes, activity reports, Congress minutes, rule of procedure, and so on, and the propaganda production. You have an example here. So it's mostly an official narrative bit from the stage of the association. But I think there can be some interesting ways to write a different history when with not a better access to better sources, while studied closely and as exhaustively as possible, not so much to detect like a normative of policing tone, which is one aspect of my work, but probably one of the least original, but rather to have precise information both on action and discourses, and through all of them. What I found the most interesting very quickly is spotting contradiction within the documents. For example, the praising of the role of the state in the documents versus the fact that when you look closely at sources, you see that it's actually the TB leagues that played a main role even with a kind of public service delegation. And second, the denial of the role of economic inequalities in discourses, while at the same time the actors were very interested in rehabilitation, so I had to acknowledge that the work condition of the TB patient were a part of the etiology of the disease, maybe. Okay, I will pass on my use of fiction and poetry as another source of finding like kind of a different framing on the question, and especially the social aspect of the question, but I really was not expecting to have to become a translator of poetry to do my PhD on health history of Turkey, so that was like one of the nice, time-consuming but nice surprise of the work. And to just conclude in 1 minute, I have the hypothesis that maybe the question of missing archives of TB in Turkey would be part of a specific process I see in my work, meaning a specific declination of Occidentalism in the field of health that I'd like to call epidemiological Occidentalism, elaborating on Volk works on representation of plague and the Ottoman Empire, and what she calls epidemiological Orientalism, meaning the totality of discursive practices of how Western European viewed, experienced, imagined, reproduced, and represented the Ottoman health scales as the European alterity. So, in an attempt to go away from the literal image of like the sick man of Europe from the Republic of Turkey, at the same time they were picturing always themselves as late in health policies compared to Western European countries. And it is maybe another reason not to keep or display archives on health or health policies. But actually the fact that the archives of TB are mostly missing contributes to the reinforcement of this epidemiological Occidentalism, as it to some extent contributes to the framing of TB control in Turkey in terms of being late, because then the historical work follows the actors who wrote so, while it was not always so simple. So I think an important part of my work is to try to avoid this narrative by looking in different way to the existing sources, including once again the international archives that shows, for example, that Turkey was a very important field and laboratory for elaborating new TB policies in the WHO, for example. Thank you. Do I stay here?
Yes, we can have 10 minutes just to ask a question, a particular question to Lea, and maybe if you have a question more bigger question, it could be more for the end of the presentation. And I don't know if there's, yeah.
Thanks, Lea, for the presentation. I have been working for a long time in the history of medicine in Morocco. So some things that you tell look familiar to me. And I wonder, because in the case of Morocco, one way out of this missing archives problem is, family archives, for example. So you have like dynasties of families that keep their archives, and it's not really a family archive. It's an archive that contains a lot of things. And then you have also archives of former officials, government officials, or people who have played a role in the administration on any field, and they have, I don't know in which way, but they have kept official documents, and you can find really very interesting things. So I don't know if you have to explore that, or if you want to comment something about that.
Yeah, thank you. It was actually a point I was planning to tackle in my presentation, and I switched because of the time. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to elaborate on this. Of course, it's one of the points I was thinking about. Actually, I was also faced with two problems. First, as I said, in the institution they were not willing to give information, and I don't know, as for the archives, I don't know if they really did not have any contact with the person who worked there before, or if they just didn't want to give me, but in any case, I couldn't have access through this way. And the other thing is that in Turkey, the family names date back 1944. So actually, a lot of persons have the same family name, and it's impossible to find a person from the family of a person. And it looks stupid, but actually, like, I have, of course, the name of a lot of persons, but I don't know who is their family. And this is actually from the only family archives I managed to find, because actually, so this is private archives of a leftist doctor who was the head of a dispensary in Istanbul during a long time, and I was very interested in this character because it's one of the rare doctor explicitly situated on the left, so I was thinking maybe he had some specific point of view on social etiology of TB and so on. And I managed to find his family actually because his brother is a very well-known folklorist who worked at the UHSS at one point. And because his activity in the political sphere, he had a book made by his family on his activity, by his political activity, not his medical activity. And I managed to contact his family because part of his nephew is working with the French Institute for Anatolian Study, and that was the only way I managed to trace back this family, and being sure it was actually this family and not someone just having the same name. And it was actually quite an interesting experience to go to the son of this doctor who had this, because he made two piles of documents, like the most interesting one and the least interesting one, and I asked if I could look at both of them, and actually everything that was really interesting was of course in the not interesting thing, because in the interesting field I had like the books, the communication in congresses that I had already seen. Why? In the not interesting part about this kind of thing, which is actually the only example of a statistical study before the coding, because here you have the family and it's like the number of it's in an area in Istanbul, and it's like the number of room per family, the number of person per room, the amount of money they earn, and so in tubercular family in a place of Istanbul. So it's the only example I have of statistic in the making, and not of like done statistics. And also the other thing you see here, it's a guest book of the dispensary, and it's just like 6 pages, but signed by all the international important characters that I've seen. So this Etienne Berthet was the doctor sent by the WHO at the beginning of the 50s to establish a TB center in Istanbul in collaboration WHO state and Istanbul TB Lab, and it means he was coming back in Istanbul and thinking of what was done in this dispensary was especially interesting, this statistical study. So it means there is really a transnational connection, but also that Turkey was doing health policies interesting for French doctor, for example, which challenges the narrative of like Turkey being late and just following the other countries. So I would have loved to have access to some others, but I don't know how I could have done it.
Thank you. Tristan?
Yes, thank you, Leah, for a nice paper. I've got 2 questions. The first one is I would like to come back to the notion of epidemiological occidentalism. How do you frame that in respect to things like scientific hegemony?
Sorry?
In scientific hegemony, concepts like that. And could you say a word about, is this the French route to German bacteriology? Not at all. It's international institutions already. The second question is more precise. I'm working on a project on European Community for Health, which is a political project post-war 52-54. And I was really astonished to see that Turkey was in that project. Have you seen anything on that?
For the first question, I think it's a way to frame the position of the actors, like the framing of the Turkish actors of their own position in the world. So this idea of occidentalism, even though I don't agree with everything she says, that is kind of blurry sometimes and have been criticized for so, but it's interesting to think of, it's not only because some have said that this concept is basically just Orientalism, but actually it's like the application of Orientalism not to other people but to yourself, and I think it's something that is quite relevant for Turkey, at least for the person I am working on, who are doctors who were, for some of them, trained in Western countries and who are really always in this narrative of being late. But at the same time, being late, it means you are in the same group as the other people. Like if you are late compared to France or to Denmark, which comes back often, it means you are in the same category. And actually, Turkey, with tuberculosis, they are thinking themselves at the same time in the group of European countries, and at the same time as leader of the Middle East, because they, especially in this center in Istanbul, they plan and they did train doctors from Arab countries. So it just I don't think it's a notion that can explain everything, but it's just to situate the way the actors themselves were locating themselves and locating their country in a general framework. And I just, because when I've read about epidemiological Orientalism, I was like, it's exactly the same thing but applied to themselves. So that's not like a way to explain everything or to connect with every theory, but it's just, I think, a concept that could be useful just to understand the internal perspective of the actors. And just regarding Turkey and Europe and health, it's connected to this question actually because at the beginning of the WHO, Turkey is in the Eastern Mediterranean group, and they protest against this, and in 1952 they managed to enter the European group they are still part of now. So I think I don't have much more information on this, but I think it's part of the same process of being at the same time trying to look at themselves at the same time in the European term. It's really a cliche about Turkey to say like it's between East and West and between Europe and Asia, but for this kind they are really playing on the two grounds of like trying to show that they are as modern and as efficient as Europe, even though they are late. But once again, being late, it's like being in the same category, but also really positioning themselves as leader of the Middle East, and especially in the frame of the International Tuberculosis Union. They are this time member of the Middle East region, and they are the leader of the Middle East region, like they are elected as the first president of the group and so on.
Thank you. I think John wanted just very, very, very short. And a very short.
Yes.
Thanks for your explanation. It's just a brief comment. It has struck me the use of the concept of Occidentalism, because I knew that there is a book by Ian Newman called Occidentalism, which is just the reverse image of Edward Said's Orientalism. I don't know if this would be useful for you, but it's interesting how to invert the scene in order to your case. Thank you.
Yeah, so just in two words, actually Occidentalism has a lot of different meanings, and it's a point that Meltem Aiska is tackling in her book, and so I'm really using the concept in the way she does it, like refraction of Orientalism applied to themselves by members of the Turkish Republic. So even though it's a larger concept.
Thank you very much. Now, so the second paper, we can maybe the second paper, also about the past pandemic, will be presented by Alejandra de Leiva, who is a PhD student at the Institute of History of Science, the IHSA in Barcelona, and also at the Institution Milà i Fontanals, also in Barcelona. So she will introduce the sources in her study of the development of syphilis serology in blood transfusion during the
Thank you, Felia. Thank you for inviting us to this session. Well, this is not part of my PhD, but we developed the subject for this occasion. So this work is intended to explore the historical sources regarding the serological control of syphilis in donated blood during the first third of the 20th century, particularly during the Spanish Civil War. It is framed within studies of history of medicine and incorporates methodologies from sociology. We have approached the sources with the idea that they don't reveal the truth, but are just representations of it. And we have taken into account their incomplete nature. Our work has primarily consisted of building and contextualizing a narrative around our findings. We have found most convenient to examine the social-cultural dimension of syphilis at the beginning of the 20th century, the understanding of its transmissibility, and the efforts made to ensure transfusion safety at such an early period of this technique. It should be borne in mind that at the beginning of the 20th century, transfusion was an exceptional and very rudimentary technique, and techniques were still at a very experimental stage. The choice of the time frame is due to two reasons. On the one hand, although syphilis has its earliest conceptual frame on the disease known as morbus gallicus in 15th century Europe, the foundations of modern approach to venereal disease were laid in 19th century within the framework of the germ theory of disease. Furthermore, the development of serology in early 20th century set a milestone in the diagnosis of contagious diseases. And on the other hand, the development of transfusion accelerated at the beginning of the 20th century, and especially during the Spanish Civil War, following the characterization of blood groups and the development of blood preservation techniques. Precisely because both techniques, serology and transfusion, were emerging techniques, it has been really difficult to find primary sources of information. So we have performed a literature search within these databases, archives and libraries with a keywords, a combination of keywords for transfusion and syphilis and self-diagnosis of syphilis in medical database PubMed, ScienceDirect, Google Scholar, IndexCat, well, the list you see here. And the primary sources have been divided into written and iconographic sources. And within the written sources, we have consulted articles in medical journals and monographs and treatises on the sociology of medicine. And the iconographic sources have been mainly pictures, paintings, and propaganda material. To enrich analysis and interpretation, we sought secondary sources on the history of blood transfusion and the history of serology. So the syphilis pathogen, Treponema pallidum, was discovered in 1905 when Fritz Schaudin and Erich Hoffmann first isolated the treponema at Berlin Charité Hospital. Although syphilis is predominantly transferred by sexual contact, treponema may also be transmitted by infected mothers to fetuses during pregnancy and intravenously through contaminated blood. Without treatment, syphilis can cause severe health problems. So until modern health campaigns and effective treatment with penicillin became widespread, the disease was a major public health problem worldwide. Its high incidence affected all social groups, though it was mainly associated with prostitution. Its infectious nature can be seen in the Latin etymology of the word, lues, which means epidemic, contagion, plague, public calamity. As can be seen on the slide, because of its stigmatizing character, neighboring countries were usually blamed for its origin, so that in Italy it was known as the French disease, in Spain as Gallic disease, in France Neapolitan disease, etc. The term syphilis did not become dominant until well into the 19th century, and nowadays syphilis is considered a pre-emerging disease because although some control was achieved with penicillin, the incidence is increasing nowadays. So syphilis became a major research area in the Western medicine during the second half of the 19th century. Alfred Fournier is considered to be the founder of modern syphilology. You can see here one of his books, the cover of one of his books, Danger social de la syphilis, where he stated that syphilis was a social danger because it destroyed the family, caused high infant mortality, stigmatized innocent children affected by congenital syphilis, and was a factor in the degeneration of the race. This idea is also present in Spanish texts, as you can see in the image on your right. Thus, syphilis transcended the individual sphere to become a social threat. The emotional impact generated by sexually transmitted diseases is reflected in the work of several painters, for instance in Edward Munch's Inheritance and Ramon Casas' poster, Syphilis. So Munch's painting, for example, is an inversion of the Madonna with Child subject, where the red paint, I don't know if you can see, well, there are some red paint around the baby's chest. This is the rashes, one of the manifestations of syphilis, and the body is deformed, as you can see. At the beginning of the 20th century, 10% of the population in the United States and Europe had syphilis, so the situation was so alarming that in 1898 and 1902, two international conferences were held in Brussels to agree on measures against prostitution and venereal diseases. Sexually transmitted diseases, along with tuberculosis, infant mortality, occupational diseases, and alcoholism, became known as social diseases. They were the focus of public health policies in industrialized countries during the first half of the century. The primary treatment for syphilis was mercury, that had many serious side effects. The discovery that specific microorganisms were responsible for infectious disease led to the search for a therapeutic substance against them. The bacteriologist Paul Ehrlich tested different arsenic derivatives until he discovered one that could selectively kill Treponema pallidum. But salvarsan, which means arsenic that saves, which was introduced in 1910, and 3 years later it was replaced by neosalvarsan that was less toxic. These drugs continued to be used as the main therapy for syphilis until the use of penicillin in the 1940s. The microbiologist Jules Bordet discovered that the immunity created by the disease or a vaccine has two components, or is due to two components: the antibodies and the alexin, which is now called complement. In 1901, he demonstrated that complement has the ability to bind to antigen-antibody complexes. This complement fixation reaction opened up a new field of possibilities, which was the serodiagnosis based on the antigen-antibody reaction. In 1906, the collective work of August von Wassermann, Albert Neisser, and Karl Bruch made possible the first serological procedure to diagnose syphilis, the complement fixation test based on Jules Bordet's work, which was later known as the Wassermann reaction. Before this test was developed, diagnosis was based only on the observation of clinical signs. They used as antigen a liver extract obtained for a newborn having died of congenital syphilis, and complement consumption, and directly demonstrated the presence of antibodies. Although this reaction is no longer used today because it has been replaced, it is worth noting that it was really important for the history of medicine to the extent of having boosted the development of serology as an independent discipline. When speaking about the Wassermann reaction, it's inevitable to mention Ludwig Fleck. In his monograph, which I'm sure you know, Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact from 1935, he studied from an epistemological point of view what constitutes a scientific fact, using the example of the Wassermann reaction. From Fleck's classic work, we will only highlight here that the idea that science depends on factors external to it. So what Fleck says that the moral significance of syphilis as a dishonorable disease and the belief that there was a syphilitic blood or impure blood posed a public health problem. This is what led health policymakers to encourage the development of the research into this subject. So the Wassermann test became routine practice for the diagnosis of syphilis. Initially, it was used to confirm the clinical observation of patients with suspected syphilis, but gradually it was used to also with healthy population, for example, in prenuptial testing. The Wassermann test affected both the social and the medical understanding of syphilis because it could reveal the disease at the asymptomatic stage, which may sound familiar in today's COVID world. Doubts soon arose about the specificity of the Wassermann reaction because it produced many false positives, leading to intense debate. This slide shows a list of conditions in which false positive serological reactions for syphilis may occur, for example with malaria, scarlet fever, and even in menstruation or pregnancy. In 1922, Ruben Kahn developed the reaction with his name, a flocculation test that did not require complement and that could be observed microscopically within a few hours. This test quickly became the standard diagnostic test, especially in the US and Canada. The Health Committee of the League of Nations organized several international congresses for standardizing serological methods for the diagnosis of syphilis in Copenhagen in 1923 and 28 and in Montevideo in 1930. The increasing diagnostic limitations of the Wassermann reaction led to the recommendation at the Second Congress that serodiagnosis of syphilis should be confirmed at least by two methods, one hemolysis and one flocculation. At the Third Congress, the Kahn reaction eventually became the standard for the second diagnostic test. So the antivenereal fight was one of the main elements of public health campaign in Europe at that time. In Spain, started in the 1920s onwards, and it was based mainly on the publication of posters, leaflets, conferences, and radio broadcasts. It became even more important during periods of war, as syphilis and other venereal diseases were often the cause of casualties among soldiers. In 1862, in order to find out whether syphilis was transmitted through blood, venerologist Pietro Pellizzari inoculated with syphilitic blood several medical students who had volunteered for the experiment, despite the danger involved. After the incubation period, one of them developed secondary manifestations and died several years later. All sources consulted agree in citing Fortis, which is the second image, as the first to describe in 1915 the transmission of syphilis by transfusion. Prophylaxis consisted of using donors who had undergone a detailed clinical and serological examination, and donated blood was also experimentally treated with various amounts of mercuric cyanide to destroy the treponema. In 1934, German researchers demonstrated experimentally that treponema is destroyed in blood preserved for 5 days at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius. The first transfusion of blood preserved in sodium citrate to prevent clotting was performed in 1914. During the First World War, there were some attempts to use preserved blood, although direct transfusion from arm to arm was the most commonly used technique. In this painting, we can see a transfusion unit of the Canadian Brigade in France in July 1918. The figure in the background on the right is performing a syphilis test on blood from a donor. An indicator of the state of transfusion in the late 1930s is provided by the results of a survey published in 1938 sent to 700 hospitals in the US. The answers to the question whether they performed serological tests on blood for transfusion revealed that only 178 from 700 did so. Articles published in the late 1930s and early 1940s reported a limited number of cases, but others indicated that many cases had gone unnoticed. The use of citrated blood was definitively established in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, thanks to the innovations by hematologist Frédéric Durand-Jordan, who directed the transfusion service of the Republican Army, and Carlos Elosri, who did it in Franco's army. Faced with the great demand for blood, other transfusion services emerged, such as the Spanish-Canadian Institute of Blood Transfusion, created by Norman Bethune, member of the International Brigades, and a pioneer of mobile transfusion services. So ensuring the transfusion safety was, of course, of great importance. It is worth mentioning the work carried out by Maria Hervás, who was head of the laboratory of the blood transfusion service of the Republican Army based in Valencia. In the 1920s, Hervas had been trained and worked at the Paris Institute, the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And in May 1938, so during the Civil War, Hervas published a paper intended to guide clinicians in the interpretation of the results of the Wassermann reaction. In the preceding 8 months, she had carried out almost 1,500 serological reactions and found a high prevalence of seropositive results, 13%, so we saw before that in Europe, US it was 10%, so more or less. Another of her concerns was to reduce the rate of false positives, false negatives in the Wassermann reaction. So she was aware of the conclusions reached at the League of Nations International Congress, which we mentioned before, and she advocated using at least 3 reactions, 1 hemolysis and 2 flocculation tests. The diagnostic procedure suggested by Hervas was adopted by Duran Jordà in Barcelona, at the Spanish Institute of Blood Transfusion in Madrid. In lacking the resources to test volunteer donors for syphilis, Norman Bethune asked them to swear on their honor that they had never had syphilis. On Franco's army, El Osegui signed on that it was essential never to use blood from a donor who had had syphilis or before knowing the results from the test. Access to the medical records and donor files, which were kept for years at the Spanish Institute for Hematology, created in 1939, might have shed some light on the types of serological tests that were done on Franco's army, but the Institute archive, as far as we know, has not been preserved. So to conclude, the history of syphilis serology and transfusion-transmitted syphilis illustrates the interaction between scientific facts and health policies with social, cultural, and moral aspects. As syphilis represented a social hazard, it was of great importance to ensure the safety of blood for transfusion. However, serological screening for syphilis in blood did not become common practice until the Second World War. In Spain, during the Civil War, serological test was carried out on both sides when the situation of the war permitted. Maria Hervas, at a time when there were very few female physicians, contributed decisively to making blood transfusion safer during the war. Regarding sources, while primary sources are vital to historical research, sometimes few written records have survived. To approach a research project where there are very limited primary resources, it is worth widening the scope of the research to primary sources from other countries, as they can offer an essential context for understanding the subject studied and make connections. And they can also help answer the question about why does that source matter in that context. Secondary sources can also be useful to fill the gaps and enrich the research with perspectives from other disciplines. Iconographic sources offer most valuable insights for understanding the social climate of the historical period studied. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have 10 minutes just for questions to our panel.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have a question about the how. So, if I'm wondering if you found some differences between the difference in the treatment of people, how so the way they treated people who were diagnosed as positive during the absence of the war and during the war. So I'm wondering if
Well, the treatment of syphilis during the Spanish Civil War was with acetamic, so substances based on arsenic, so with salvarsan, etc., and derivatives, because penicillin was not used, although it was discovered in 1928 by Fleming, it was not used generally for syphilis until the 1940s. So the main treatment continued to be during the war, the Spanish Civil War, arsenic derivatives, and they were used. There was not. I don't know if there was more patients treated because of war. This is what your
so my question is, if there were more material contracts or limits during the war, I think during the war there are more emergency status. So if I'm wondering if that changes the way the state treats the syphilis, the people with syphilis.
Well, the thing is that because of blood transfusion became so important during the Spanish Civil War, they started to screen for syphilis when they could. I mean, it was a war, so it was difficult to get the reactions, the serums and everything, and it was also difficult to get the moment to test everything because it took time, and so of course there were more reactions than before because it was a more normalized procedure. And but the thing is also that it was very important when they discovered that blood was contaminated. Of course, they didn't use it, but it was something very, very negative for the donor, because the donor was rejected. He was offering his blood to save somebody else, and during the war, people gave their blood without remuneration. This changed afterwards, but it was a dishonor for them to give to know that their blood was contaminated and to be rejected. And also, of course, it was very, very negative when somebody was transfused with a blood that hadn't been checked and he got syphilis. And of course, because there was no cure, or the cure was salvarsan and neosalvarsan, but it was not as effective as penicillin later in time. So it was a really important problem to screen and to treat when it was possible to.
There is no difference. El micrófono creo que no hace diferencia.
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandra. I was wondering if you, because I'm very interested on the debates about immunity and all, how we can use blood to treat patients, linked to the idea of serotherapy and so on. So I was wondering if during the Civil War there are also debates about the problem that sometimes when there was the blood transfusion, you can kill someone if. Okay, nowadays we know, but it was a huge debate at the moment. So first I was wondering if there was also this kind of debate during the Civil War, and two, since Spain became a kind of open-air laboratory for these kind of studies, if the research that was carried on in Spain helped to shape the debates about immunity and so on in Europe in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. Well, I will start with the second one because it really, it helped, but not for the immunity part, but because of the technique. Because during the Spanish Civil War, it was mainly Frederic Durand-Jourdan from the Republican Army who developed a technique which made blood transfusion much easier. And I mean, because before the blood transfusion techniques we used were mainly direct, so from arm to arm. And during the Spanish Civil War, what Duran-Jordà achieved was to make the transfusion as easy, very easy, so that somebody with some knowledge, but not necessarily a doctor, it could be a nurse, that they could transfuse blood. So the technique was made much easier. And this was afterwards replicated during the Second World War in London, because there was a British hematologist, Janet Vaughan, who knew Duran-Jordà and who talked to him about what to do in the case that there was a Second World War, because it was 1939 and they were expecting that something happened. So Janet Vaughan, with the help with Duran-Jordà, helped to set a service, a blood transfusion service in London, which was like a replication of the Spanish system. And regarding the first question, the first question was...
So the first was about these, the problems that sometimes when you transfuse the blood, you can kill someone. So if there was this debate about the reaction there are
Yeah. Of course, because the problem with blood at the beginning, at the beginning of the blood transfusion, was the problem with blood groups. But blood groups were discovered in 19. Well, and after that, this permitted the possibility that not so many problems with blood. But of course, it was not only that, but it was also the transmission of malaria, the transmission of syphilis, and other infection diseases. So this was a debate among physicians, and it was very present in the literature, in the medical literature. So the example of Maria Herbas is very important, because she analyzed the Wassermann reaction and why it had so many false positives. And she intended to guide clinicians in Spain who maybe hadn't read the literature to perform the reaction well, because it was a very complicated technique, so it needed some steps to be done well. So yeah, of course, there was a debate, a growing debate.
Thank you very much for an interesting paper. I've got 3 questions. The first one is, could you be a little bit more precise? Is the systematic American screening of the mid-30s related to the Spanish situation? Is that received and is that a model for them? The second question is, could you be a little bit more elaborate on Spanish data? Is there any sources that give systematic quantitative results for Spanish testing during the Spanish Civil War? And the third one is the Wassermann test is not only used for the blood testing. I mean, originally, what's interesting here, the proposal is to say this is about syphilis, basically. So syphilis testing has been going on, but all of a sudden blood becomes important, since that's a way to do it. The testing becomes actually blood testing, not syphilis anymore. And the next step is pretty close in time, because it's the late 30s, early 40s. It's the eugenic question and the systematic testing during premarital tests and certificates. Could you link that a little bit in with the serological testing?
Yeah. Well, the serological testing, as I said, was used. At the beginning, was used only for suspicious cases, but because syphilis was regarded as a danger, it was afterwards generalized to the population. So it's true that especially in the US, but also in Europe, in France, in several countries. Before getting married, you had to have a prenuptial screening for your blood to test that you didn't have syphilis. It also was something that happened in the army. So when you were going to the army as a new recruit, you also got tested for syphilis. So it was generalized into the population. So it was not only to confirm suspected cases, but also to check about syphilis and to check that you were not contagious. I don't know if that answers your question.
What about the Spanish data?
What about the Spanish data? You mean what we found on? Yeah, the thing is that the information we found is mainly from the testing from the army. I mean, for soldiers during the Spanish Civil War. So, of course, there was testing for blood donors, but it's mainly not in hospitals for civil citizens, but in hospitals for blood for the army, for the soldiers. The other question, sorry. And I don't remember if there was an idea.
Okay, so yes, we are a bit late, so thank you very much. And Elena? Yes. Maybe we can discuss these things after. Sorry. Okay, so our third and last paper, we focus on the quarantine and historical use of COVID sources. So we are going to hear Elena da Silva, who is an historian at the Institute of Contemporary History in La Universidade Nova de Lisboa in Portugal. And she wrote a PhD on nursing history, and later she worked on the health of Portuguese soldiers during the First World War. And today, among other research projects, she's conducting the brand new Memory COVID project, which she tells us about now.
Thank you, Celia. I take this very few moments to congratulate the organizing committee for everything, especially for choosing this wonderful place. Yes, like Celia was saying, I'm an historian, so today I'm not really gonna do a traditional presentation with the sources, aim and results. I'm going to talk to you about this project, this Memoria COVID project. It is an ongoing project, so I'm responsible for it. It's a collaborative project. So I will speak how, why, some results, some pain points. I will link to some of the ideas that were mentioned earlier this morning, so I won't repeat what was said. I'll just mention some key ideas. So basically, why this project? Well, like Celia mentioned, I've worked on First World War and obviously on the 1918-20 flus, known as the Spanish flu. I was part of the team in Portugal that was supposed to organize the 100 years anniversary. So we did several conferences that are available on YouTube. Everything's in Portuguese, obviously. We also did a book. You can see the cover of this book. At the time, there were so that goes back to 2018. There were lots of ideas, and one of the things we wanted to do, or someone wanted to do, was to do an exhibition with images and so on. And we realized that in Portugal there are very, very, very few images of the Spanish flu, what I will call Spanish flu, although it was a Spanish flu, as you know. One of them is the image that is actually in the cover of the book, that is a temporary hospital that, well, there are some images, but it's not what we're used to see. For instance, the international images we have, where we saw yesterday Camp Fusten, we have here some images with the wearing masks, we even saw images with cats with masks. Well, in Portugal we don't have that. Even when we have temporary hospitals, we have images like this. This is a Red Cross temporary hospital in northern Portugal, where we actually don't see much, just a house with people. It doesn't speak that much. There's this other image that is actually at the Red Cross hospital in northern France during the First World War. On the heading, it was written pneumonic infirmary, but they're not separated like we saw in the previous image. So yeah, all of that to say that for the Spanish flu, we didn't have that many images. So that's why it became the so-known forgotten pandemic, especially in the Portuguese case. And especially if we compare with First World War, we have lots of images of the Portuguese hospitals, again in northern France. We have images of the destruction, but, well, you know the history. It became the forgotten pandemic. So we arrived to February and March 2020, and I was contacted almost daily by journalists that wanted images of Portugal, images of the pandemic. They wanted to show it, and I had nothing to show. So they were very disappointed, obviously, that's another story. So we were thinking, again, going back to February and March, well, this time we'll have lots of images. This time we'll have lots of things. I don't want to be working on that in my retirement because they will have a lot of things. But at the same time, we were also thinking, today we live for the day, for the moment, for the now. So we take lots of photos, but how many of us actually print them out, actually write what it is, where it was taken? We have lots of things on social media, but who keeps them? Who's gonna collect them? Like Christian mentioned, everything is a bit of volatile, everything can disappear, it's urgent, we need to quickly act. So that's what we thought of in March 2020. Also, we could see on the news photos of infirmaries and so on, but we wanted to go more into the private sphere, like Clea mentioned a bit. We wanted to have people's opinion, and we knew that we were all being somehow affected by the pandemic. We couldn't escape for it. For the first time, almost everyone was being affected by this. So I worked, at the time I was still working in Lisbon at my lab, the Institute of Contemporary History, where we were already used to have days for collecting memories. So I told my boss at the time, saying, oh, you should do something to collect the memories. And he said, okay, you do it. Obviously, I didn't want to because my contract was coming to an end, but nobody else wanted to do it, so I have this baby in my hands for almost 2 years. So I didn't create a website. Like it was mentioned earlier, we have a digital humanities lab that did all the website, and they deal with the website. That's why it's important for everyone, historians, to work within a team. Okay, so they did build the website on Omeka S. Well, I'm not an expert on it, but because it can be useful for you in the future, for anyone else. What is Omeka S? It's actually a Web 2.0, so it's very easy to use. There are lots of tutorials online, even for historians, we can use it. It's also an open source, it's for free. It allows to have structured data. That means that it's ready for the web semantics, even if we don't know anything about web semantics. When it means also open data, it means free access, so we can ensure that in the future it will still be there, hopefully. It's also confidential. So that means it's not saved in my computer, it's saved by them. So hopefully it will be available for the next decades. Okay? So we started working on the project since, really creating this website since April 2020. We started having a look at what was being done. Some of the websites that Christian mentioned earlier, like the 11th September, 13 November in France, I had a closer look to everything that had been done and was being done at the time already with other projects in Germany, in Austria, to create this website. But unfortunately, it took a bit longer than expected. It only went really live online on the 13th July 2020. Okay, so to quickly show you, I guess, see, because I need to go to the website if it works. Yeah, so, we don't see now.
Voy a tratar de conectarlo, ¿vale?
Funciona, pero que no lo vemos.
Funciona esto. Funciona en internet, pero no lo veo.
Es que yo creo que sí está en la pantalla del escritorio. No
claro, porque es como otra pantalla que ellos han hecho para esto.
Vale. O sea que no sabéis cómo...
No sabría, sin tocar,
okay.
No sabría.
Esto no tenemos acceso.
But if we do F5, F5, F6? Non?
Je pense que tu es sur partage écran.
F10? Non?
Je pense qu'ils ont mis en fait une...
Oui, c'est drôle.
Ils ont fait deux bandes.
Non? Si, wait. C'est là.
Tu pousses ce câble.
Mais du coup, c'est où lequel?
D'accord.
Attends.
Sí, lo que pasa es que no tenemos acceso allá.
C'est este aquí, ¿no? Solo pantalla de PC.
Cuidado, toca eso que se puede configurar.
Saliendo la pantalla completa.
Es que el problema es que no lo podemos tocar.
No, it's not working. Wait.
Sí.
Wait. Mas porquê é que não dá?
Tú estás a proyectar solo pantalla PC. A ver, intenta duplicar.
J'ai fait F10, mais là ça marche plus la souris. Okay, so it's not going to work as it's expected because I was hoping to show you the website, which means I won't be able to show you anything. Or la souris ça marche pas. Attends. Ok, that's what. Oui, mais ça fonctionne pas. Attends.
Se podría desconfigurar.
No. Sí, no.
Bueno,
sí. Bueno. Historians and computers, sometimes it does work. So, okay, so this is the project. The website, you can have a look later on carefully. It's in Portuguese. So, very shortly, we explain what we want. The idea is that, like I said, it's a collaborative website. So anyone, as long as the person has a connection to the internet, can share a memory of the COVID. Obviously, COVID in Portugal, I forgot to mention. So we explain what we want. It can be videos, images, text. So internet is very slow. People can share, they give a little title, they can write, they can put up an archive, when it happened, where it happened, name, email, age, and obviously they need to agree that they that the data will be kept by the university, by the project, and can be used in future research. This is everything that lawyers did. So we have then also some memories. I'm not going to show it yet to you. We can search by memories or by the map if people put up the location. There's also a part of the press, what was published, a bit of everything, the team and the context. So this is shortly the website. So going back to my PowerPoint, if it still works, and now it won't obviously work because you will see both. Okay, so, well, yes, it does work. Okay, so when it went online, the project, nobody understood what happened. When it went online, there was a lot of media coverage, so that helped the project to work very well in the beginning. Here are some of the screens of the some of the news. You know, like academics want to gather memories and documents about the pandemics in Portugal. This was already later on. A journalist actually used some of the memories. She interviewed those people and did a news, very long news on that. So saying that we are somehow all protagonists, all taking part of the history that we are living. So about the results, because I wanted to show you some results, and now it's going to be the second part. So the number of total submissions since 13 July 2020 and today, well actually yesterday because I didn't check today, we had a total of 106 submissions. So this morning you mentioned thousands, and I know Frederick, so we spoke about it. Yes, he has thousands, but we don't. So that is, we're going to see why. And this is not the only case for Portugal. Brazil as well has a Memoria COVID project, and the number is ridiculously low compared with the size of the country. Okay. And you can see that in the beginning it was high, and then it goes. Then whenever there was a journalist on the radio or anything, the number was going up, and then once in a while we have new submissions, but the number is very, very low. A bit of disappointing, but we'll see why after. Well, maybe Not all submissions are public. What does that mean? Well, why they are not public? Because sometimes they are double, people send them twice. Sometimes people don't give permission to go public, so I cannot put them public. So I write to them to resubmit and accept, but they don't, so I cannot do much. Sometimes people change their submissions, so yeah. So basically we have 87 memories. And from these memories, we have mainly images, then text, videos, and on sound. That means, well, maybe the best is this one. We have about 66 images, 15 text, 5 videos, and 1 sound. And these are the ones that are public, that anyone can see online, not the ones that are not. So I'm not going to show you everything, but what I wanted to say is that first, although the number is not that high, they're very different. You know, it goes from, if it works, it doesn't. Okay, so I'm gonna do it again. No, it's not this one, this one. Which one was it? This one, okay. So this one, it's one of the first ones we had with a mother that speaks pandemic, working home, and bad mother, and she writes at the beginning, what she felt of the pandemic, and so on and so forth. So we have what we have. So sorry, I'm gonna try to show you like this so that hopefully it will work. Yes. We have a lot of, well, basically we have a lot of things from the lockdown. We have a lot of images, paintings, drawings. For instance, this one, the granny playing with the doll of her little daughter that she wasn't seeing anymore. So what else I can show you? We have songs. Well, I'm not sure there will be the sound. This is, we should have tried this before, but there's not the sound, it's okay. But he wrote a whole, no, but it's okay because either way it's in Portuguese, so you wouldn't be able to understand. But in the song, he says that the kids are going away from Lisbon to save themselves from the virus, and he's no longer going to see the kids. He speaks about it, so he wrote a song that is with the name Emma, Quarentena. So it's a very good song actually. So we also have, still on the quarantine, this is from Madeira, the islands, and these are a group of traditional music that kept doing rehearsals, but each one in their home. So obviously I'm not going to show it all, but they did it and they submitted, which is actually, like I said, not something you would see on the news or elsewhere. They had it on Facebook to show that they kept doing their rehearsals. So this is one of the memories. What we have, we also have what we kind of all lived, people showing what were their days during the quarantine. Obviously, wait, I'm gonna stop so it downloads. I did not mention, but in the beginning I was expecting to see some memories, you know, people doing the bread, people doing the masks, sewing masks, and actually sometimes the expectations did not meet, were not met. So in this video, like one day of a couple living in Lisbon, what was their day? Okay, they're very tidy, hairdresser, clothes, so let's do it at home. Doing the gym or yoga, like many people did at home, just because it's still a bit eating outside, trying to get some fresh air. We have, obviously, this is around Easter time, so we will see them cooking. Maybe I'm gonna go a bit because the internet, so they try to cook following an online recipe, probably the first time they were ever cooking something like, no, because we see it, you know, like the bread with the eggs inside, that is typical of them. I see it here, typical for Easter. I guess we all did this at a certain point in our lives. You know, working and eating and, So this is a good video, see? We were speaking about la vie privée, the private space, the private sphere, okay, so this is it, and I will keep focus. So we have, again, during quarantine, we have also a lot of poems. So this is an example. I'm not going to show you everything, but this is an example. There are 51 pages of poems. Almost every day he wrote a poem, and we have coronavirus, emergency, spring, and he speaks about his days during the coronavirus, during what was being at home and so on. So this is, it's worth to be analyzed, you know, everything in deep. So that's, we could do lots of things. We have one of them, one of the memories, there was a lot of debate actually of, the title is in English, Reinventing Easter, because a couple went to see the granny, but they were all the time aside and they had lunch, like you see. We do have a group that was created to sing happy birthday to elderlies living in nursery homes. And so they share several images, okay, of where they were going. They were singing by the windows, so we have their experience, how it was to play in times of COVID, for those that have kids, what were children playing in times of COVID. We have obviously a computer with some Zoom or whatever. We have also some points of view from healthcare professionals, which I have already used. I'm not gonna go 5 minutes, perfect. We also have a young girl that the parents are health professionals, and she writes of what she felt in the beginning. It was like it was a third World War coming, that she thought she would never see her parents again. And yeah, so we have personal points of view. We have diaries as well. There was well, actually, she's a journalist, but she wrote every day a little bit of her life, and then she shared her memories as well here. And we still have other things about the lockdown, the first lockdown. This one, why I had already chosen before. It was submitted on the 13th October 2021, so a year later, and the title is Enjoying Nature. So actually, it's quite positive. It's a bit like we were speaking this morning, like 1 year later, he's saying that the lockdown was actually positive because it took the time to plan things, to live the moment, and so on. And he mentioned that they even got married at this point. But I think it's 1 year later, they're already rememorizing their points. Okay, so you can go into this website and have a look at the other memories, okay? But we do have, I think, somehow a positive side of the lockdown. We can see that these are memories of people with higher education, you know, many of them actually from the university, or journalists or media, you know. We don't see point of view from people that were like working in supermarkets or cleaning or so on. So that gives me to the pitfalls or pain points that I've actually mentioned. And this is not an order, but they're all somehow linked. It is extremely difficult for us to have new submissions. I see still today, every day, people publishing things on Facebook or on Twitter, and I'm like, this is great, don't you want to go to the website? And they don't. I have nothing on Portugal and the elections in January 2021, when the country was on the second lockdown. I have nothing on Christmas, on testing. Last Christmas, everyone was testing at home and putting photos of the negative test, but we have nothing like that. So it's difficult to have new submissions. Sometimes we have very, very short descriptions. People just write COVID. And then everything is linked together. It's this very small team. Well, it's me and the lads with the Humanity Labs. So I have to select and accept and refuse. Who am I to decide what's going to be used in the future or not? And last but not least, I have no budget. So without we don't do hamlets without hags, so I cannot do much. People ask me, what are you going to do with it? And the aim is that it goes online. The aim is that others can use it in the future to do whatever they want with it, but I cannot do much because I don't have the money for. So we did several meetings with other colleagues, European projects. There's some here, including there was Frédéric. There's in France. There was also a project, Vitrine en confinement. There are Germany, Austria, Luxembourg. Some of them are in the same situation as I am, with very few, apart Germany, very few submissions, very few budgets, and so on. And what are we going to do with it? That's up to you. Like you said, we can use it for many things. And I think I have to end here, so thank you, and we can speak afterwards. Because I guess everyone wants to go for lunch.
Thank you. So we can have just now a few questions, like a 10-minute question just for Elena, and maybe we are short on time, but maybe Elena and meanwhile, Lea and Alejandra can come. And if you want to address some more general question, it will be possible.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your presentation. Just a very specific question. So it is maybe that the Portuguese don't like the images, so it's something cultural, because you said you didn't find images of the Spanish flu in 1918, and now it's difficult for people to share this. So maybe you can reflect a little bit.
Maybe people don't. I don't think that people don't like images. I think people don't want to share, because that's what people ask me. It's going to be online. When? Until when? What are people going to do with that? That's the Portuguese. They're very. Who are they going to? Who's gonna? I don't know. I think. Yeah. I think that is one of the reasons. And it takes time to go to this website to fulfill little things. So, and they are skeptical about it, I think. Yeah. And it's easier just to put it on Facebook or Instagram or whatever than on this website. So I'm actually smiling because I was thinking, you can send your Zoom from the conference we did.
I have two questions.
It is.
Okay, so yeah.
This probably has no answer, but do you have any way to check the truthfulness? This may not be a big issue in Portugal, I don't know, but I can imagine places where people write, okay, I got picked up by the police and tortured, and basically anybody could write anything, right?
You mean if the memories are true? If they're...
Because we were talking about this morning.
Yes, yes.
There are always interests in producing memories in order to get, some.
Yeah, but actually that's that's a very no, I don't, because when people submit, they mention that they are the authors of the memory, if there's an image and so on, but I don't know. I don't know if they are, and indeed I did not mention, but sometimes people send videos where they have music, like, I don't know, I'm gonna give an example, Rolling Stones music, and I cannot put it online because I don't have the rights. So it's the same thing. I imagine people are the authors of the photos, but maybe someone will one day come and say, oh, that is my photo, but they gave the right to share it, so That is, yeah, I don't, and I cannot know.
Actually, my question was, I have two questions, but one of my question was about metadata, and I don't remember if maybe you can put the slide on the formulario.
This one?
No, about the metadata. How did they enter it, the information?
Ah, the website.
Yeah, the website. No, el formulario que presentaste no principio.
É na primeira página, aqui o projeto, aqui a conta. Oh, okay.
And maybe how people, because you are going to make a work on this metadata to say, okay, this contribution came this day and another contribution, and so to follow the story of your sources, of the memory.
Yeah,
but
okay.
also maybe the problem is how the contributor contributed to this selection of metadata. So how did they present their memory?
Okay, so what you see here is the official website, what anyone can see. Yeah, maybe I should have done a print screen of what are the metadata. This is something else. It's Omega S. It's very easy. We use Dublin core, and we select if it's a text, an image, a moving image, or a sound, or we can select what it is, and then it does arrive to these tables that I did. But I don't. I just then accept if it's online, and I check that everything is okay. I do not change. I did not change anything. When people wrote something, if there were mistakes, I left it like that. I didn't do anything. That's why I said people can write the place, or they can put it in the map. If it's not in the map, I haven't added it. Because that's what the submission as it was submitted. That's the idea. And the metadata, yes, we can then see how many people have accessed the website. We can see how many submissions, but that I haven't put. It's very easy to use. I haven't put on mine on the PowerPoint. Could have, yeah. And then the question was on the that's why well, if any of you one day wants to do collecting memories or anything else on using Omicas is relatively easy. Once the website is done, and they explain me what I need to do, and it's very easy. It's really easy. So that's okay.
Other specific question? Yes, Mateusz?
Obrigado, thank you very much. So, because you said that it's quite scarce to find things in Portugal and also in Brazil. So I was wondering why not to create a kind of website to reunite both sides of the empire, and also Angola and Mozambique, because you can imagine that it's also difficult to find memories about COVID in the Portuguese, the African, the former Portuguese colonies in Africa as well. So I don't know if maybe you have this idea in mind that to have a kind of a memory of Lusophonia and not only about Portugal.
Yeah, thank you, Mateusz. Yes, in the very early beginning, I was interviewed by an African, Africa, something like that, and they asked me about it. Well, will you do elsewhere in, I don't know, Angola, Mozambique? And I said, why not? But by the end, when the number of data is so scarce, I thought maybe it's going to be even worse. And it was already difficult to deal. I've applied for funding and I had nothing, so I was thinking, yeah, like I said, it's a project that's kind of fell into my hands. Well, I've asked for it kind of as well, but now it's a bit difficult to do it. But with the colleagues I mentioned, at a certain point we mentioned having an European project that could link all the countries, and we couldn't do it. So I think it's not that easy. Yeah. It's easy in the paper, but then it does need a lot of mobilization so that people in Germany, they created a prize so that schools, but that means that there are minors. So they had to be the parents submitting what the kids were doing or what the parents were taking photos and so on. So that brought a discussion to what is really online, who actually does the photos or the images or the drawings. Yeah, so it's still, but maybe sensitive data as well, you know.
Other questions? So I have different questions. One of the questions. I have a provocative question, two in fact. One is obviously how do you pass, you are an historian, you said it, from the memory project to history, do you have any idea, hypothesis? And I have another question is, in fact both for you and our other speakers, it's a provocative one. You say I am the one who is deciding, and I don't have to decide because it's not my role. So my question is, it is our job to do that as historians, and I know it's what I'm saying. It's like in French we say l'avocat du diable, but because I don't really believe it, I think yes, this is our job. But the question is why. We are here in Congress more in medical historians, but we have some colleagues here who are anthropologists. So why historians can do this job? Why are we doing this job? It's a very open question, and I have some ideas from your presentation. Because I think all the presentation talk a lot about time, but I was interested to know your opinion.
Yeah, so like I said, earlier this morning, the idea of this project was to have online a website to collect, to preserve, to make available, and then someone else should use them, not me. It's not supposed to be me, and I said this a lot of time. Anyone, any of you, it's online, you can use it. Anthropologists, sociologists, journalists actually use them once in a while. So it's not me. Maybe in 40 years' time I will go back to this, maybe. But I will correct myself saying that I do use them. I did use one of the nurse with the shield, because I did a talk on the importance of oral history for the history of nursing, and I did mention obviously in the past and then going to COVID, and I did mention that it was urgent to collect oral history of nursing professionals in Portugal, like it has been done in the Netherlands, for instance. And I did use one of the images. So again, obviously I know what's on the website, so it was easy. But the idea is not for me. Anyone can use it. So yeah, again, what I did is that I don't choose actually what's online or what. Everything goes online unless if I see something which has not happened, but if it's not linked to COVID, if it's obviously something taken from a web page or something that it doesn't seem original, and the only memories that didn't go online are those, like I mentioned, when there are musics or so that I cannot put online. But I did contact the people that sent it saying, okay, the music you're using, do you have the rights to use it? No. So you can submit it again with without the music or with a public file, which was actually the case of the couple, the video we saw in the beginning. I can't remember, but it was a very known song, and then they resubmitted. Yeah. So I don't choose, because it's not for me, up to me to choose actually.
Okay, thank you. And I don't know if we have 5 minutes exactly. Question for you?
Yeah, that's
Since Sylvia asked for reactions, what I hear and see for the time being, but it's just a reflection, I don't know whether it's worthwhile or anything. I think social sciences produce the data, be this in anthropology, ethnography, social sciences. Historians use them, but they're not used to producing them. I don't know whether they consider that finding archives, that archives haven't archived, whether that is producing data, but that's as far as historians go. They find data that others have stored away for whatever reason, and finding them, being the first to find them, that becomes almost a proprietary question. They belong to me, or etc. Sometimes, not always, but what web archives do to a certain degree is that the producing and the finding kind of matches, goes together, collapses, and once again, that basically that means that in that perspective, at least what I see at this point, is that the distance between these social and human sciences just seems to be less and less, actually. And I'm not saying that everything's going to be the same thing in the end, right? I think the more important, we always say we've got different methodologies in human and social sciences, and maybe that's being revised. We may remain with different questions, different approaches, but it's just thinking about this. Your response just on this.
I mean, I see what you mean, but we've had oral history projects for a long time. So, and that's historians doing it. I mean, I see it's different because then you ask questions, and I guess it comes with the methodological considerations. So I don't necessarily contradict you, but I think just it's complementary.
Yeah, but okay, let's see. Let's take the example of these memories. If I wanted to use any of them and actually develop them, I could actually get into contact with the person and then ask the questions, which I actually ended up doing sometimes by email, going a bit further. I don't agree. We do produce sources somehow, because it's what I said earlier, the Institute of Contemporary History, we did lots of what we call memory days, where people could arrive with their journals, with books, with photos, with objects, and we did it about lots of topics. Could be about an industry, could be about the revolution, the First World War. So by the end, and some of these memories were then used by other colleagues, but we didn't produce them, but we searched for them. And when people were arriving, we were asking them questions. So by the end, yeah, you know, it was not just an object. We were questioning to try to have more and more and more according to us historians. Don't know if it makes sense. Yeah. But
thank you very much. I think we can talk about it later during the meal. Don't be afraid. We already informed the vote that we are going a little bit late. So I think tenemos que hablar del método ahora. After. So thank you very much for Sorry, we have a lunch there in the same place where we are taking the coffee break. Okay.
yeah, with the websites. Yeah. Mark asked me already about it. So yeah. Your email is on the program. I might have it on my emails as well. Sorry, wait. It's better to. Yeah, oh, here you go. Can you write it? Sorry.
Wow, you took all these notes from my
Oh, God. Take your time.
Without a dot.